tables are called maize. So whether Mesa comes from Arabic into Spanish, I don't know, but it is just an observation. Before I start on adolescence and violence, and particularly I'm focusing on migration, we had a roundtable in London last week on Tuesday and Wednesday, which was about extremism and extreme violence. As you know, in Europe, certainly lots of second generation, third generation, fourth generation migrants are going to Syria and Iraq and elsewhere and fighting in so-called Islamic State. One of the issues that sort of struck me while I was trying to prepare this talk was also that there was a study from the United States about 18 months ago which showed that the younger generation, Generation X or millennials, are said to be much more narcissistic. Now, it's an American sample. It's psychology students because, that's where most of the research is done. Because if you want credit, you fill in this questionnaire and you get the marks. But it raises some very interesting questions about changes in society. And as I said earlier, that partly it's about urbanization, that much more nuclear families, less family support. And certainly in the UK, I cannot tell a child off in the street for misbehaving because I'll be immediately accused of, either child abuse or something worse. Whereas in places like India, and I don't know whether it's true in Mexico, the community behaves as community parenting. So if children are playing outside and they're making noise or they're doing something wrong, any of the neighbors will come and say, don't do this, and they will listen to it. So it is how things are changing both at a social level, but also bearing in mind that one of the key challenges for us is about attachment patterns and how we bring children up. And again, there was a study probably about 2 years ago now which showed that attachment patterns in childhood determine brain structures and therefore go on to determine brain functioning. So it is, we need to bear these factors in mind. I'm going to sort of illustrate some of this by using migrants and migration, and particularly it's also quite important that we have had 3 or 4 roundtables in Latin America looking at migration. And it is, part of the issue here is how to define migrants. I'm here for 2 days. Am I a migrant? Probably not. But it needs to be contrasted with legal classification of particularly refugees and asylum seekers and characteristics and motivation for migration. And we know that age at which you migrate, your gender, whether you're a primary migrant or a secondary migrant, whether you have any choice in migration, and whether you're educated or not. One of the other observations that we had was about quite often people migrate, that they may be professionals in their own country, but they can't find jobs. I was in Copenhagen in a taxi which was being driven by a Pakistani driver. So we got talking and I was talking to him in Punjabi and we chatted away. Lights changed, at traffic lights he stopped Another taxi stopped in the next lane. They both lowered the windows, chatted to each other, and lights changed and they drove off. So I said, who was that? So he said, oh, he's my cousin who's a lawyer. But he can't get job as a lawyer, so he's working as a taxi driver. So again, I want you to sort of bear that picture in mind, and I'll come back to that. We've talked about whether you're forced to migrate, and whether you are migrating for a short period. You think, okay, I'm going to go work for a year, 2 years, save this much money, come back, buy my own property, and settle down. Or you have no idea whether you go for. I mean, I went to the UK to study psychiatry, and the plan was that I would go back. And then you do stupid things like fall in love, and you don't want to kind of leave them and settle down and not go back. And there are a number of occupations where migration is quite a regular phenomenon. Diplomats move every 3 years. People in higher education, journalists, those in military service, missionaries, and then there's obviously seasonal migration. And there are stages of migration. The pre-migration is when you prepare for the process, and migration is about the physical process, and then you have the post-migration. And I want to focus very much on post-migration because this whole process of settling down in a new country, your aspirations that I will migrate and I will become president of the World Psychiatric Association. And if you don't achieve that, what does it do to your self-image? And acculturation carries on. It doesn't stop. There's both individual acculturation and group acculturation, so the group that you migrated with. So again, one of the observations that you need to bear in mind in that process is that the children may acculturate better, quicker, because they're going to school, they're studying, they're meeting other people, whereas women who may not have a job, may not get out of the house, may find it much more difficult to acculturate. And that raises a tension between individuals within the family. And generally, again, I want you to bear this in mind because related to the question of violence, all these three things play a role. The first response to migration is cultural bereavement, and then it could be culture shock or culture conflict. Cultural bereavement is basically that you've lost things. You've lost your friends, you've lost your property, you've lost your social connectedness, you've lost your relatives, not in the sense that they may have died, but you've left them behind and you've moved on. And that sense is quite often migrants have this unnatural attachment to the past, where the past is idealized. And it's also, you see the culture that you've left behind as perfect and ideal. A new culture is somehow horrible. So what that does is it also creates this degree of dissatisfaction. So that cultural bereavement obviously depends upon personality and whether they migrated alone, whether they migrated voluntarily, and various other factors, and I'll come back to that. Question is whether those who migrate for educational or economic reasons also experience cultural bereavement. I think we do, simply because you have a very idealized past in mind. You have a very idealized view of the culture. Everything was perfect. If only there hadn't been a war or America hadn't invaded Iraq, I would have been fine. Who knows, but that's the idealization. And quite often, individuals feel guilty, particularly refugees, because they may have survived. So there's a degree of survival guilt. They may have abandoned others, and they have very intrusive thoughts of ancestors, elders, and their own past, with morbid thoughts along with anger. And I think it's worth remembering the question of anger. And it's about locus of control in managing this grief. Can I, deal with this? And again, part of the tension is that Western constructs on bereavement are very different from other cultures. Among Hindus, for example, the bereavement process after death is supposed to last for 11 months. And in those 11 months, you're not supposed to do anything joyous or happy. So by DSM criteria, that could be seen as abnormal grief reaction. So we need to be very careful as to how we deal with that. The second response to migration is about culture shock, that people may feel completely alienated in the new system. And again, from my own experience, I landed in London on 30th of November. Very short days. I came out of Heathrow at about 3:30 in the afternoon. And it was pitch dark. And my instinctive response was, where have I landed? Because I'm used to sunshine and staying up till midnight. 3:30, it's dark, what am I going to do? It takes adjustment, and now I'm perfectly adjusted to the fact that yes, in the winters the days are going to be very short and you do what you need to. But that shock is related to loss, and it is related to subsequent stress, which affects the process of acculturation. And these feelings of anxiety and helplessness and impotence confirm that the new culture is not only remarkably different but also unwelcoming and alien. And this alienation adds to further anxiety, which leads to difficulty in alienation, so you get into a vicious circle. And again, in terms of violence, you need to bear that in mind, that may be the getting revenge response to shock. And the third reaction is culture conflict. The culture conflict can be between the majority culture and the individual, but it may also be within the same culture who have migrated. And as I said, children may have acculturated much more rapidly. They may be thinking in English, speaking in English, Spanish, whatever the new language is. Parents may find it very difficult to learn a new language, settle down, have very old traditional views, and therefore these attitudes to cultural identity become much more rigid. So those who are born and brought up in the new culture may hold values of the new society, and this tension may lead to cultural conflict. And it is how this conflict is resolved across generations which becomes incredibly important. And when preparing this, I did a literature search, and I could find only one study which looked at acculturation in the third generation. So think of it this way, that the first generation comes in, they're grateful that they've survived, they're grateful that they are safe, that they have, a roof over their heads, and they try and keep quiet because they don't want to be fingered in that sense and say, that you're creating trouble. Second generation, because they're studying, working with their larger majority peers, they feel that they must belong, but the larger society does not necessarily accept them, because you're still, the fact that we're using words like second generation migrant says something, because that means that once a migrant, so for generations you'll remain a migrant. So they may feel much more alienated, but they may find some acculturation by ways of biculturalism. But the third generation has it worse because they ought to feel, let's say, British. But for whatever reasons, Britain is not accepting of them because they're third generation migrants. Even though they've been born and brought up and imbibed British values, whatever they may be. So they then start to feel much more alienated, and when they hear stories about what happened to their grandfather, and so that history becomes incredibly important. And at the round table last week, there was a member of the House of Lords who was a psychotherapist, who was presenting tensions between Roman Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. So he said in the 1970s, at the height of the Troubles, one group came to him and said, 44 of my co-religionists have been killed. Never heard about it. There's nothing in the newspapers, nothing on television. But it happened in 1644. So people remember that history. And part of the response to migration and acculturation is the recollection of that history in terms of violence and in terms of trying to take revenge. And cultural conflict is about cognitive dissonance as well. That at one level but your family's culture may be different from yours and your friend's culture may be different, but at another, you want them to like you for who you are and you want to fit in, and therefore there are those tensions, particularly at adolescent levels. And we know that cultures have 5 dimensions: egocentric, sociocentric, masculine or feminine, power, distance, how disempowered individuals feel from the source who's making decisions. Can I approach them? Can I talk to them? Can I influence their decision making? And the processes that we are seeing in America at the moment, the whole sort of Trump following, and the results of Brexit are partly because people feel very alienated, that they have no say in how they are governed, how close or distant they are from the center of power. It's about culture's value of uncertainty avoidance. Some cultures are very good, some cultures are very bad. And what is the long-term orientation of the culture? And it is that when we're looking at both acculturation and violence among adults, we need to look at the new country's responses as well, which will depend upon their values, their attitudes, which affect their behavior. Now again, looking globally, what is really fascinating is that in UK, we talk about multiculturalism. In America, it's called melting pot. In Canada, it's about rainbow nation. So how the new country sees various groups, they don't really need to be migrants. But again, in America, for example, the traditional attitudes of the sort of New England Brahmins, wasps, who sort of came on the Mayflower, and after that contributes to a sort of kind of caste system, and a class system which becomes very difficult to traverse. And part of this response is that I have no access. So how am I going to take action and get something? And acculturation means learning the language, it means learning the rituals, it means learning the behaviors. and changing your attitudes. And sometimes individuals, I'm using second generation, third generation migrants in the sense that they're commonly understood terms, but there is a problem, as I said earlier. People may feel decultured, that they don't belong in their parents' culture, but they're not accepted by the new culture and completely isolated, alienated. And that's the kind of thing that leads you to join gangs, because that gives you an identity. It gives you a sort of sense of belonging, that these are my people, whether you have the same membership card or whether you have the same tattoo or something else. So that sense of belonging. And then obviously in a few generations people may or may not assimilate. So in addition to the sort of migratory processes, issues about conflict, estrangement in an adolescent, feeling alienated from the family, from school, from your friends, feeling isolated, and particularly now this whole social media and the impact of social networking sites has become incredibly important. When somebody says, you know, I have 450 friends on Facebook, are they really your friends? So who would you call if you're feeling stressed? You know, do you just do a posting on Facebook and hope that somebody out of those 450 responds? And if they don't, then you're alienated and isolated even further. And changes in family structures, and particularly as a result of urbanization, much more nuclear families, and it's been described as helicopter parents who are both working, they sort of come down to earth for an hour or 2 hours a day, and then they fly off again, and adolescents are left by themselves. And also in certain circumstances, uncertainty and anxiety about the future. Okay, I get my degree. What do I do then? Where are the jobs? And particularly youth unemployment is a high indicator in terms of alienation. And we know, and I'm not going to go through various responses to migration, but I want us also to remember in the whole migratory scene is about their specific vulnerable groups. People who have low income, women, children, elderly individuals, those who have poor physical health. And we know that migration can lead to various losses. And in terms of jobs, migrants have lower rates of shortlisting and hiring. They're more often sacked. They have lower rates of pay, poorer promotion prospects. So that is what the adolescents are seeing. And why would I want to do that? So I might as well grab something, and that may be belonging to a gang. And discrimination against migrants is a further problem, and we've seen it by the politicians in both in the USA and the UK. Brexit was a prime example. Also, particularly media may play a role. We know that migrants have fewer investigations, and there are structural discriminations as well which may contribute to the sense of migration. And I'm not sure whether you can see it at the back, but these are individual vulnerabilities which may push people to alienation, particularly in terms of pre-radicalization. So there are protective social factors. Social capital is one. So if you have friends, you are accepted. There's cultural congruity. So more people from your culture are around you. You don't need to sort of explain things. People understand. Automatically you feel acculturated. And the concept of self may change. And once that starts to change, then there may be sort of pre-radicalization and self-identification, moving on to indoctrination, jihadization, thoughts, and may or may not lead to acts Thank you. Never ask the question to which you don't know the answer. Okay, we're back to the original country. Okay, yeah. So the causative factors may be, there's been some data, and I'll come back to that. Depression, low self-image, isolation, difficulties in acculturation can again contribute to this pre-radicalization, self-identification and indoctrination, leading on to sort of further terroristic, violent attacks. Now this is very much a public health model, and you would be wondering, what has psychiatry got to do with this? We are trained to deal with mental illness, and this has got nothing to do with mental illness. But this is about public mental health, that we need to understand what's going on in order to make sense of it. And as I said earlier, that as a result of violent attacks, mental illness and violent attacks are being linked. And these are being conflated with acts of terrorism. There was a story quite recently in London. Somebody killed a tourist, and it was immediately seen as a terrorist attack, and then they said, no, it's about mental illness. And it has become, I think, mandatory in the UK that if we see a patient who's expressing these kinds of thoughts, we have to report them to the police. So that changes the whole doctor-patient, therapist-patient relationship as well. And obviously, often we are asked to provide advice as expert witnesses, but also on preventive work and risk assessments. And a big challenge for the society as a whole is this role of religious fundamentalism and political ideologies. How do we work that, and how do we differentiate that from religious practices and religious beliefs? And as I showed you in that figure, that violent radicalization is often erroneously linked to be the direct result of religious fundamentalism. And it is that if you're Muslim, you're automatically seen as suspicious. And, the fact that Trump has the audacity to stand up and say that he will stop Muslim migrants, does that mean that everybody has to convert to another religion in order to migrate? And there are also issues about sort of national values and identity. And it's always, I found it quite amusing. I've been in Britain for 30 years. No, 36 years. How time flies. I still don't understand what British values are. I know some of the things that, it's about punctuality, and it's about commitment, and it's about delivery if you sort of contracted something. But those are actions, are those values? So we need to be questioning our policymakers as to what that means. One of the interventions that is being increasingly developed in order to stop this political radicalization is about acculturation. So it's culturally constructed, and it is seen as that individuals should give up their cultural values and become homogenized or return to their countries of origin. And again, I find that very difficult to accept, that people migrate for all kinds of reasons. We are all individuals. No two individuals are alike, and that's why I went into psychiatry, because that was such an exciting thing to do. And Cam Bui and his colleagues have done sort of a couple of studies that those who are in education, who are studying and are born in the UK are more likely to sympathize with violent radicalization. So that then raises the question, is it something about the system in terms of education, or is it something else that is alienating these individuals and they're not being a part of that? And interestingly, they also reported in another study that mild depressive symptoms are associated with sympathies for violent protest and terrorism, which had also been reported in zones of conflict, but in invoking severe psychotic depression rather than mild depression. Say, having suicidal thoughts that, if I'm going to kill myself, I might as well take 20 people with me. And there have been similar cases, the German Wings tragedy, Egypt air tragedy a few years ago. So it is, we know that depression has been implicated in acts of aggression and social isolation. So there may be a link between psychological, social, and clinical and criminal experiences in radicalization. But it's also, on the other side, religion does provide a coping mechanism. Particularly when you're stressed, when you're lonely, when you're isolated, you go because you want to meet people who are in, who understand your religion, who understand your language, who understand your behavior. And it is something that we as clinicians need to bear in mind. So there are 4 coping strategies related to religion and religious fundamentalism. So it provides a sense of meaning and coherence to life. It provides a structure. It provides extreme orthodoxy and coping at an individual level without involving God. So most of us, no matter how religious or atheists we are, when we are stressed, we do call upon, oh God, help me, oh my God, even in sort of your social media. And that may be sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek. And particularly at times of uncertainty, identity confusion and fear, as you feel the group you belong to is being assaulted, vulnerable youth may take up fundamental ideologies because it validates who they are. That's one thing positive in my life, and therefore I'll stick to it. And therefore religion, which is a clear part of cultural identity and acculturation, will affect religious values. So we know that, as I said earlier about acculturation, that originally it was a group phenomenon, but it's become individual. Studied in first and second generation, but not only one paper, as I said, in the third generation. Small groups face existential uncertainty, and their cultural continuity becomes significant for emotional survival. And that reflects both the past and the history. Remembering that in 1644, 44 people were killed, and that's 356 plus 17 years, so 373 years ago. And if people are still talking about it, it is about the cultural identity and continuity. And that becomes incredibly important. Third generation, as I said, feel at loss because they may not feel a sense of belonging to either of the cultures and feeling alienated, isolated, and looking for identity. Violent radicalization is not a new phenomenon. It's always been there, but it's become much more obvious. It may reflect grievances. It may reflect inequalities, whether they're related to social status or health. Discrimination, poor education, poor employment, along with poverty may play a role. And you may well say that this is all very nice, very left-wing liberal view. These people are criminals and they should be treated as criminals. But I think we do need to understand the context within which people are born, within which they live, within which they work, within which they exist. So it is partly the poor political engagement, sense of alienation, and again, religious conversion is quite interesting. That in a study that I was involved in many years ago, people with first episode psychosis, something like 25% had changed their religion in the 6 months before being diagnosed with psychosis. So whether that means that they were trying to find another identity, finding a solution, finding another group which will accept them, we need to explore further. And outcomes of that may be radicalization and terrorism, but what drives people down this path rather than gang membership or drug use or other types of offending, we need to explore further. I haven't touched upon adolescence and violence against oneself, and I hope very much that over this day and a half we will also look at that, because the rates of self-harm in adolescents are going up, and we need to find out what's going on. And among migrants, these have always been higher. So actions for us and policymakers is about early prevention. I mean, in the UK, classroom teaching on extremism is now mandated, and mental health and health professionals are being asked to play a role in preventive interventions as well as to help identify those vulnerable. There are ethical and moral questions in that we need to address in any society. Is it my job as a clinician to be a spy for the government and say, so-and-so is going to go and become radicalized? I don't know, but as a society, we need that debate. And these professional dilemmas we need to explore. And we know, to sort of draw it to a conclusion, that migration itself is a stressful process. Acculturation is the process by which we adjust ourselves to the new society, new culture, make new friends, meet new people, learn new languages, new behaviors, attitudes. How do we deal with this real trauma of migration and bereavement? And there's obviously a threat in help seeking, that particularly if you're feeling alienated, why would you go into a healthcare system which may report you? And therefore, the therapeutic alliance and adherence becomes much more challenging, and we need to find ways of dealing with that. So once again, I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to 2 days of further discussion, debate, and muchas gracias.